Welcome to the deep dive. We're jumping right into something truly massive today.
Massive is the word for it.
I mean, we're looking at this incredibly exhaustive exploration of the multifaceted drivers behind the U.S.-Israel conflict with Iran. And when I say extensive to you guys listening, I mean we have an absolute mountain of source material sitting on the desk right now.
I really do.
We've got dense geopolitical analyses. There's deep investigative journalism into the global surveillance tech industry, which is terrifying, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
We have historical breakdowns of religious theologies that date back centuries, and these incredibly in-depth reports tracking the flow of lobbying money and media propaganda. It is a labyrinth.
It is a complex web. And, our mission today is to take this massive stack of data and synthesize it into a clear picture for you. We want to understand how all these seemingly disparate pieces actually fit together.
Right.
Like, how do global power structures, deeply entrenched religious groups, we're talking both Christian and Jewish here, and these shadowy behind-the-scenes methods like billionaire lobbying, algorithmic surveillance, and narrative manipulation, how do they all intertwine?
How does it all connect?
Exactly.
Right.
Ultimately, we are tracking how these elements act as a literal engine driving geopolitical conflict. And most importantly, how this vast machinery impacts everyday people around the globe.
Right. But before we go down this rabbit hole together, we need to make a pact with you, the listener.
Yes, crucial.
Absolutely essential that we put this up front. The materials we are unpacking today contain highly, highly politically charged content.
All right.
These documents span multiple, often fiercely opposing viewpoints, so we want to be crystal clear with you right now. We are strictly remaining impartial.
Strictly.
We are not taking sides here. We are not endorsing any of the viewpoints, the religious interpretations, or the political claims presented in these materials. Our sole job here, our only agenda, is to faithfully report, synthesize, and unpack the ideas exactly as they are contained within the original source material. We're just your guides through the data.
That's it. We're looking at the mechanics of these arguments, not validating them. And to understand those mechanics, we really have to start by looking beyond the official narrative.
Okay, let's get into it.
So officially, the public is told that the U.S. military campaign, Operation Epic Fury, and the Israeli campaign, Operation Roaring Lion, are fundamentally about national security.
Right. That's what you see on the evening news.
Exactly. The stated goals broadcasted everywhere are counterterrorism and preventing Iran from becoming a nuclear threshold state.
But the geopolitical analyses in our stack completely deconstruct that.
They tear it apart.
Yeah, they contrast what is being said at the press conferences with the stark material reality on the ground. The analytical consensus in these documents frames those highly publicized security concerns as a smokescreen.
A very effective public relations sham, basically.
Masking the true cold imperatives driving the conflict, which are capital accumulation, the aggressive defense of global financial hegemony, and the absolute monopolization of Eurasian energy corridors.
Right, and to really grasp the scale of this, we have to look at the geography, specifically the Strait of Hormuz.
Okay, yeah.
This is a critical choke point in the Middle East, and the text emphasizes that roughly 20 to 21% of the entire world's petroleum and liquefied natural gas flows through this one narrow waterway.
Which, let me just put that into perspective for you listening, because 20% might not sound apocalyptic until you realize how fragile global supply chains actually are.
Oh, they're incredibly fragile.
Right. If that strait is disrupted, it's not just about a temporary spike at the gas pump. You are looking at a cascading failure across global manufacturing, shipping, agriculture.
Everything.
And according to the analysis here, disrupting this route isn't just about putting pressure on the Iranian government. It is a targeted strategic blow to China's energy supply.
Because they rely heavily on oil flowing out of that region.
Exactly. So that's the first major layer.
Yeah, and the second layer is about the currency used to buy that energy. The global standard for decades has been the petrodollar.
Meaning oil is bought and sold almost exclusively in U.S. dollars.
Right, which forces countries around the world to hold massive dollar reserves, cementing U.S. financial dominance.
But there's a shift happening.
There is a growing movement toward de-dollarization. Rivals are trying to establish a petroleum trading energy in Chinese currency. And the documents argue that kinetic military action in this region serves as a violent physical deterrent to that shift.
Wow, so it's a message.
It's a huge message. By creating immense geopolitical instability, it spooks the global markets and drives global capital fleeing from risk straight back into the perceived safe haven of U.S. Treasury yields.
It's essentially using military force to ensure the dollar remains the undisputed king.
Exactly.
And there's a fascinating, well, deeply cynical, really financial twist here. The United States is no longer entirely dependent on Middle Eastern oil.
No, not at all.
The U.S. is now a net energy exporter, holding around a 22% market share globally.
Right.
So when conflict erupts in the Gulf and oil prices spike, and the source's project prices could surge to 70, 90, or even well over $100 a barrel in a prolonged conflict, the U.S. domestic energy sector actually benefits.
They make a killing.
The analysts call it a war premium.
It transforms war into an incredibly lucrative economic engine for specific domestic sectors.
Yeah.
And speaking of economic engines, the sources dedicate significant space to the staggering profits generated for the military-industrial complex.
I mean, the numbers are insane.
We are currently witnessing what the financial reports describe as a massive defense tech supercycle. Every time a $1 million missile is fired or a fleet of drones is depleted, those munitions have to be replenished.
Which means a continuous, multi-billion-dollar pipeline of public taxpayer wealth is being transferred directly into the hands of private defense contractors.
Yeah. But the financial incentives outlined in these documents go even deeper into the territory of disaster capitalism. There is a term used in these financial circles that is just, it's incredibly jarring.
The peace dividend.
Yes, the peace dividend. And it is jarring because of how it's being applied here.
It's not about peace at all.
Not even slightly. In this specific context, the peace dividend refers to the long-term ambition of completely destroying the current Iranian state apparatus.
Just wiping it out.
The goal, according to these geopolitical blueprints, is to violently source open Iran's massive, previously isolated energy reserves and state-owned enterprises.
They want to integrate a historically resistant, closed-off state into the global market.
Exactly. Allowing Western venture capital and multinational corporations to essentially buy up the country's resources at fire sale prices once the dust settles.
It's corporate expansion facilitated by military devastation.
That's exactly what it is.
And this material drive isn't just about global energy markets, it's also about the physical land itself. The documents detail massive real estate and infrastructure mega projects that are just waiting in the wings.
Yeah, they specifically outline ambitions for the Ben Gurion Canal and the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, or IMA.
Right. The Ben Gurion Canal is proposed as an alternative to the Suez Canal, running right through Israel.
The goal here is to establish absolute maritime and logistical hegemony over Eurasia, entirely sidelining Chinese and Iranian influence over global trade routes.
And while that macro-level restructuring of global trade is happening, there is a micro-level reality playing out simultaneously on the ground.
Yes. The analysts point out that the literal fog of war, a massive, all-consuming regional conflict with Iran, creates a highly permissive environment for localized territorial expansion.
Because everyone's looking the other way.
Exactly. With the world's attention, the media cycle, and international diplomatic bandwidth entirely fixated on the major theater of war in the Gulf, factions within the Israeli government are allegedly utilizing the chaos to drastically accelerate land appropriation.
And real estate acquisition in Gaza and the West Bank.
Right. It is a brutal, calculated economic logic. They are converting conquered land into state and private equity while the international community is distracted.
But, and this is the major hurdle for the people planning this, you cannot run a democracy and simply tell your voters, hey, we are going to send your children to fight and die, and we're going to spend trillions of your tax dollars so that venture capitalists can buy Iranian oil and we can build a new trade canal.
No, the public would revolt.
Right. They would never accept that rational cost-benefit analysis. They demand diplomacy. So how do you bypass democratic skepticism?
You have to make the war about something much bigger than money. You have to elevate a war for resources to the absolute status of a divine imperative.
And this is where it gets really dark.
This is the psychological mechanism the sources dissect. And it brings us to the profound theological engines driving this conflict. Because when you transform a geopolitical strategy into a moral, biblical absolute, it fundamentally bypasses all logical debate.
If a war is perceived as a direct command from God, you can't argue against it.
You can't use international law or human rights or economic costs to argue against God.
Okay, let's unpack this. The investigative reports trace the roots of this ideological engine back to Christian Zionism in the United States.
Yes.
And what's crucial to understand is that this isn't some ancient fundamental tenet of early Christianity. The sources actually trace its popularization back to 19th century dispensationalism.
Right, we're talking about figures like John Nelson Darby and the widespread publication of the Scofield Reference Bible.
So to understand the modern political impact, we have to understand the theology here.
Well, dispensationalism is essentially a framework that divides the entire scope of human history into distinct periods or dispensations. The core driving belief of Christian Zionism is that humanity is currently living in the absolute final dispensation.
The end times.
Exactly. They believe the clock is running out. But for the end times to officially commence and for the second coming of Christ to occur, a very specific checklist of prophecies must be fulfilled on the physical map of the Middle East.
And according to the text we reviewed, that checklist is incredibly rigid. Jewish people must return to and control the entire biblical land of Israel,
The third temple must be rebuilt in Jerusalem.
which happens to be the current site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Right, a massive complication. And finally, a massive, cataclysmic, world-ending war known as Armageddon must take place in the region.
And the documents provide some genuinely shocking evidence of how this 19th century theology is playing out inside the modern U.S. military apparatus right now, today.
It's alarming. The reports highlight data from the Military Religious Freedom Foundation, the MRFF. They have received over 200 formal complaints from U.S. troops deployed across all branches of the armed forces. Yes. These service members are blowing the whistle, reporting that their military commanders are actively, overtly framing the impending war with Iran as God's divine plan.
I mean, think about the implications of that. You have troops whose commanders are telling them that a former U.S. president, Donald Trump, has literally been anointed by Jesus to light the signal fire in Iran.
The language being used is explicitly apocalyptic.
The sources point to figures like Pete Hegseth, highlighting how a crusader ideology is being pushed within the Pentagon, even to the point of ordering the military chaplain corps to aggressively promote this specific brand of militant Christian faith to the troops.
The danger of injecting this mindset into a nuclear-armed military command structure, you just cannot overstate it. The sources explicitly describe this convergence of military power and apocalyptic theology as a literal death cult.
A death cult.
Yes, this is an ideology that looks at terrifying realities like climate disaster, global instability, and mass casualty warfare, and instead of seeing them as crises to be solved, views them as positive signs of a divine reset.
So they want it to happen.
They are actively cheering for the apocalyptic devastation of the Middle East because they believe it is the prerequisite for their ultimate salvation.
And this isn't just a fringe element in the military. It is a massive cultural force. We're talking about millions of everyday Americans.
Absolutely.
The reports detail how generations have been indoctrinated since childhood. They sit in massive megachurches every Sunday and are taught that supporting Israel's most hawkish, aggressive military actions is not a matter of foreign policy.
It's a direct requirement for their own personal eternal salvation.
Right. The foundational catchphrase driving this entire voting bloc is "Bless Israel or be cursed," which is their interpretation of Genesis 12.3.
But the sources point out a tragic, deeply unsettling irony at the very core of this Christian Zionist theology.
Yeah, this part is wild.
While it publicly demands absolutely unconditional, unwavering political and military support for the modern state of Israel, the underlying theology itself is subtly yet profoundly anti-Jewish.
Because when you look at the actual timeline of their prophecy, it becomes really clear why. In this end times framework, the Jewish people are not viewed as autonomous human beings or equal partners.
They are merely theological pawns.
They're instrumentalized. According to the dispensationalist timeline, once the cataclysmic war is triggered and Jesus returns, any Jewish person who does not immediately convert to Christianity faces absolute eternal destruction.
The reports argue that in this worldview, Jewish lives in the Middle East are viewed as required sacrifices to secure Christian salvation.
It's incredibly dark, and simultaneously, the sources note this exact same theology is overtly, aggressively anti-Arab and anti-Muslim.
Yes, it relies on dehumanizing entire populations, framing them as literal demons or just mere obstacles standing in the way of God's master plan.
It is an ideology that treats real human lives as acceptable collateral damage in some cosmic drama.
Exactly. But this religious engine isn't only firing in the United States. The documents show a terrifying mirror image on the other side of the conflict.
Right. Let's look at the Israeli side. Because we see the rise of Israeli religious nationalism and messianic extremism. Just as there is a Christian apocalyptic vision driving American foreign policy, there is a Jewish messianic equivalent driving policy from within the Israeli government.
The analysis points specifically to the mainstreaming of the temple movement. The sources name organizations like the Temple Institute and highly influential figures like Rabbi Haim Richmond.
And their explicit, publicly stated goal perfectly aligns with the Christian Zionist checklist.
Yes, they want to systematically destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, which is one of the holiest and most sensitive sites in the entire Islamic world,
Right.
and build the third temple in its place.
And the critical takeaway from the intelligence reports here is that this is no longer a fringe underground movement. Proponents of this radical theology now occupy the highest echelons of government power.
The documents cite Itamar Ben-Gvir, the current national security minister, who was an ideological disciple of Mir Kahan.
Okay, to understand Ben-Gvir's influence, we have to look at Kahanism. The political science breakdowns in our materials describe Kahanism as a fascist Jewish supremacist ideology.
Its primary platform advocates for the total forced removal of all Palestinians from the land.
And it is vital context for you listening to remember that Kahan's original political party was actually banned in Israel in the 1980s for being violently racist.
And his ideological followers in the U.S. were designated as a terrorist organization.
Yet today, that exact ideology holds the reins of national security.
We see this extremist ideological shift directly reflected in the rhetoric used by the state's leadership to justify the war. The sources document prime examples of this, noting how Prime Minister Netanyahu has repeatedly invoked the Amalek doctrine in national addresses.
And for context, Amalek is a biblical reference to an ancient enemy of the Israelites. But the biblical commandment regarding Amalek isn't just a standard call to defeat an enemy army.
No, it is an explicit divine commandment for total genocidal annihilation.
Sparing no one, not men, women, children, or even livestock.
Furthermore, the geopolitical analysts point out the highly calculated timing of military strikes on Iran. They note how major escalations have been specifically timed to coincide with the Jewish holiday of Purim.
And the biblical story of Esther.
Right. That story is about an ancient plot to annihilate the Jews in Persia, a plot that was ultimately violently turned back upon the Persians themselves.
So by rhetorically framing the modern Iranian state as ancient Persians or Amalekites, the leadership is using ancient biblical justifications to legitimize modern kinetic military action.
And mass casualties.
Yeah, when you step back and look at the synthesis of these two theological engines, it is just a chilling realization. You have a terrifying convergence of apocalyptic worldviews.
American Christian Zionists are actively seeking to trigger a regional Armageddon to bring back Jesus,
while Israeli messianic extremists are actively seeking to hasten the arrival of the Jewish Messiah through massive regional conflict and the rebuilding of the temple.
We are talking about nuclear-armed nation-states whose policies are being heavily influenced by factions that actually genuinely want the end of the world.
It's a recipe for absolute disaster.
It is.
But, holding radical theological beliefs doesn't automatically grant you the power to buy billions of dollars in advanced weaponry or pass binding legislation in Congress.
No, you need infrastructure for that.
Right. To understand how these apocalyptic beliefs actually manifest as global policy, we have to examine the mechanical infrastructure that makes it happen. We have to look at the shadowy, highly organized world of lobbying and megadonors.
The investigative reporting here is incredibly detailed. The sources outline the massive machinery that translates religious fervor into political absolute power.
And they introduce us to CUFI Christians United for Israel. This organization was founded by Pastor John Hagee.
And as we mentioned earlier, it boasts an absolutely massive, highly organized base of over 10 million members.
10 million!
And the key insight from the reports is that CUFI operates in a direct, deeply symbiotic relationship with AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee.
The political scientists in our sources describe this symbiotic system as a highly refined form of legalized bribery.
That's a good way to put it. The mechanics of it are brilliantly effective. CUFI provides the sheer, overwhelming grassroots numbers. They provide the massive, single-issue voting bloc.
So when a key vote is coming up, they can instantly flood congressional offices with thousands of phone calls and emails from local constituents who have been primed by their pastors all Sunday.
Exactly. And then AIPAC and its vast network of billionaire megadonors, on the other hand, provide the sophisticated financial machinery, the targeted opposition research, and the strategic policy direction.
And the financial numbers the investigative reports drop are just absolutely staggering. This isn't passing the plate church money.
No.
The text notes that casino magnate Miriam Adelson funneled $173 million to Republican candidates in the 2020 election cycle alone.
$173 million. That is an astronomical sum of money capable of swinging entire national elections.
And the influence flows from multiple directions. You have figures like Jared Kushner, a former senior White House advisor, receiving a $2 billion investment from Saudi Arabia shortly after leaving office.
Which illustrates how massive streams of Gulf wealth are also flowing through these deeply connected influence networks.
$2 billion. This overwhelming financial leverage guarantees a specific outcome.
It ensures that politicians in Washington maintain unquestioning, ironclad support for Israel and its military campaigns.
Regardless of any violations of international law, civilian casualties, or human rights concerns.
It guarantees the smooth, uninterrupted authorization of $3.8 billion in annual military aid funded directly by American taxpayers.
And it also ensures the aggressive passing of anti-BDS laws at the state and federal levels.
Right. These are laws that literally penalize American citizens and contractors for choosing to boycott Israeli goods.
Which legal scholars in the sources highlight as a massive, glaring violation of First Amendment rights.
The documents give very concrete, recent examples of the brutal consequences for any politician who dares to step out of line or advocate for Palestinian human rights.
They detail how Representative Jamal Bowman was systematically ousted from his seat after the lobby funneled unprecedented millions of dollars in opposition spending into his local primary race.
Entirely burying him in negative ads.
Yeah. They also reference claims made by Representative Matt Gaetz, who stated that the enforcement mechanisms are so strict that politicians literally have QR codes scanned at AIPAC events.
QR code.
Yeah, so the organization can track their attendance, monitor their loyalty, and enforce compliance.
It functions as a highly organized, massively funded political enforcement mechanism. And this is the moment where we need to connect these macro politics directly back to you, the listener. Consider the fundamental health of your own democratic representation. When massive, world-altering foreign policy that dictates war, peace, and the expenditure of billions of your tax dollars, is dictated behind closed doors by billionaire megadonors and single-issue PACs enforcing a foreign nationalist or apocalyptic religious agenda.
Is it still a representative democracy?
Or is it an oligarchy dressed up as one?
It's a critical question that these sources demand we ask. But the architects of the system know that you can't just buy the politicians.
You eventually have to deal with the public.
Exactly. If the public realizes they're being manipulated into a war for corporate profit and apocalyptic prophecy, they will revolt. So to keep the populace compliant, you need to control the information they consume.
Which brings us to the exhaustive media analysis in the sources.
Yeah. Detailing how state actors and corporate monopolies manufacture consent through propaganda, linguistic manipulation, and outright intimidation.
The media analysis in our stack is fascinating because it deconstructs how major news outlets often function as an unofficial propaganda arm.
Yeah.
Their primary role in this ecosystem is to sanitize state violence, softening the reality of war to manufacture public consent for what the legal critics in the sources argue is fundamentally an illegal, aggressive conflict.
The linguistic breakdowns of these media reports are incredibly revealing. The sources provide fantastic, specific examples of this deeply ingrained bias from legacy outlets like the BBC and the New York Times.
They analyze the sentence structure of major headlines.
Yeah, let me give you an example from the text. When Israel or the U.S. bombs Iranian targets or Palestinian infrastructure, the media almost universally defaults to passive, detached language. A headline will read something like, "At least 148 dead after reported strike on school," Iran says.
And you have to dissect what that specific phrasing achieves psychologically. First, it completely removes the perpetrator.
It doesn't say who dropped the bomb.
Exactly. Second, by using the phrase reported strike, it casts immediate doubt on the reality of the event itself, suggesting it might not have even happened.
What?
And third, by appending Iran says, or Hamas-run health ministry says, to the casualty count, it immediately frames the death toll to the reader as inherently untrustworthy enemy propaganda.
The bias is literally built into the grammar. But watch what happens when the situation is reversed. When Iran or an allied militia retaliates, the media's language instantly flips to active, highly emotive phrasing.
Right.
The headline suddenly becomes, 9 dead in missile attack on Israel as Iran strikes region, wreaking havoc.
The perpetrator is explicitly named. The attack is stated as an absolute, undeniable fact.
And highly charged emotional phrases like wreaking havoc are strategically inserted to maximize the emotional impact on the reader.
It is a subtle but incredibly powerful masterclass in manufacturing consent. It subconsciously instructs the reader every single day whose lives have value, whose deaths are a tragedy, and whose deaths are merely questionable statistics.
And the investigative reports make clear that this isn't just about journalists having a subconscious bias, it is about the consolidation of corporate ownership.
The sources detail how a small handful of tech billionaires are aggressively consolidating control over global media conglomerates.
They specifically name Larry Ellison,
The billionaire founder of Oracle.
and a massive financial donor to the IDF, who has been in the process of acquiring massive media empires like CBS and Paramount.
The clear implication drawn by the analysts is that this top-down ownership ensures that pro-war, pro-Israel narratives remain the dominant, unquestioned baseline across mainstream broadcasting.
Furthermore, the intelligence documents expose a highly coordinated psychological operation, a literal psyop, specifically targeting the Iranian diaspora community.
This is a huge piece of the puzzle. The reports outline how U.S. and Israeli intelligence apparatuses have worked behind the scenes to artificially elevate specific pro-war voices within the Iranian expat community.
For example, they heavily promote and fund the deposed Shah's son, Reza Pahlavi.
The media presents him as the legitimate, democratic alternative for the Iranian people, completely ignoring the fact that he is a highly divisive figure with little to no organic support on the ground in Iran.
And this is where organizations like the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, or the FDD, play a crucial role.
The historical background in the sources claims the FDD was originally founded specifically to promote Israel's image.
But they strategically rebranded and changed their name after 9/11 to sound like a neutral, pro-democracy think tank.
Their primary function in this psyop is to put an Iranian veneer on the push for bombing Iran. They curate and amplify voices that make it appear as though the Iranian people are actively begging for American bombs to liberate them.
But what happens to the Iranian Americans who see through this, the ones who actively speak out against military intervention and advocate for diplomacy?
The investigative reports are grim on this front.
They detail how these anti-war voices are subjected to a vicious, highly coordinated campaign of threats, intimidation, and weaponized cancel culture.
They face constant death threats, severe pressure is put on their employers to fire them, and they are targeted by massive social media bot swarms designed to artificially drown out their voices.
The goal is to utterly silence any grassroots dissent and create the false, manufactured illusion of a monolithic community demanding regime change.
It is a comprehensive three-pronged strategy for control. You control the politicians through massive campaign finance, you control the overarching narrative through media ownership and linguistic bias, and you violently silence any organic grassroots opposition through targeted intimidation.
Which naturally leads us to the question, how are they orchestrating this intimidation? How do they know exactly who to target, who is speaking out, and what their networks look like?
And that brings us to the truly terrifying technological reality uncovered in these documents. We are looking at the mechanics of the global surveillance state and a strategic doctrine known as Pax Silica.
The architecture of the digital dragnet.
This section of the source material is arguably the most alarming because it moves away from theory and politics and deals directly with the hard technological infrastructure of control.
The investigative tech reports focus heavily on the explosive growth and integration of companies like Palantir, Babelstreet, and Celebrate.
Let's break down exactly how these tools operate, starting with Palantir and Babelstreet. Amnesty International reviewed massive tranches of Department of Homeland Security public records.
And they found that software like BabelX and Palantir's Immigration OS are currently being deployed by the U.S. government to fully automate mass monitoring and threat assessments on an unimaginable scale.
To understand BabelX, you have to understand sentiment analysis. This algorithm doesn't just read your posts. It continuously scrapes your entire public digital footprint across all social media platforms.
It analyzes the language you use, assigns a sentiment score to your political views, and calculates a likely intent to your behavior.
It then feeds that psychological profile directly into massive centralized government databases.
And Palantir's overarching software then acts as the ultimate aggregator.
It pulls in that social media profile and combines it with your tax records, your private health data, your immigration status, and the location data from every license plate reader you've ever driven past.
It completely obliterates the traditional firewalls that were supposed to protect citizen privacy and civil liberties.
The documents show exactly how this is being weaponized right now. They detail how Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, is using this aggregated data for a program called the Catch and Revoke Initiative.
The State Department is actively using these AI-driven threat assessments to arbitrarily revoke the visas of international students and marginalized groups.
And the reports emphasize that they're particularly targeting student protesters on university campuses who are advocating for Palestinian rights.
What we are witnessing here is the terrifying introduction of literal pre-crime into the justice system.
The sources document cases where individuals are being deported to highly abusive, militarized prison systems in places like El Salvador.
Not because they committed a crime,
But based entirely upon an AI's algorithmic presumption that they might commit a crime or associate with a gang in the future.
and that presumption is based entirely on their online behavior, their neighborhood, and their social network connections.
It's dystopian.
Yeah.
But it's not just software running in the cloud. It's hardware hacking in your pocket.
The tech reports detail the deep ongoing relationship between U.S. domestic law enforcement and Celebrate, which is an Israeli intelligence tech company.
The documents show that Celebrate holds a massive $11 million contract with ICE alone.
Celebrate manufactures specialized physical devices designed to violently bypass the security of your smartphone. They plug it in, and it extracts everything: your encrypted signal messages, your minute-by-minute location history, your deleted photos, your entire life.
And this technological transfer highlights a broader, deeply concerning trend that the human rights reports call the deadly exchange.
For years, various U.S. police departments have been traveling to Israel on specialized training junkets to learn what civil rights critics refer to as worst practices from the Israeli Defense Forces.
The reports highlight a specific documented example: the Baton Rouge Police Department taking a trip to Tel Aviv in 2014.
This trip was funded by a mixture of government grants and private entities, and the explicit purpose was to train U.S. domestic beat cops on how to utilize Celebrate technology and advanced surveillance techniques.
The grim, unavoidable reality highlighted in the text is that these advanced surveillance technologies, including AI facial recognition and predictive policing algorithms, are frequently tested, refined, and perfected on the captive, occupied Palestinian population in places like Hebron.
Before being packaged and exported to the United States to be deployed on American citizens.
We are also seeing the aggressive introduction of entirely new AI-driven platforms like the Gideon program.
Right? The investigative journalists uncovered promotional material where an Israeli special operations veteran is openly pitching this AI threat detection platform to U.S. law enforcement agencies.
The pitch explicitly boasts that Gideon utilizes an Israeli-grade ontology to scrape the deep internet 24/7, actively searching for signs of grievance buildup and hate speech.
Let's translate what grievance buildup means in practice. It means the AI is monitoring gamers on Twitch, it's analyzing Reddit threads, it's scraping the comment sections of YouTube videos.
And the civil liberties advocates and the sources issue a stark warning. Given the political climate, these tools will inevitably be weaponized to target and monitor everyday Americans who are simply expressing critical opinions of Israel or questioning U.S. foreign policy.
This relentless push for technological supremacy brings us to the overarching geopolitical concept of Pax Silica.
The reports heavily emphasize this term.
What exactly is the strategy behind Pax Silica?
It is a brilliant, albeit ruthless, strategic doctrine. Israel recognizes that it is a small nation surrounded by hostile neighbors. To guarantee its survival and dominance, it is systematically positioning itself to become an utterly irreplaceable, indispensable node in the global AI, surveillance, and silicon supply chain.
By pioneering, patenting, and controlling the foundational technology that powers modern intelligence gathering, mass surveillance, and autonomous military targeting.
They are creating a new form of material diplomacy.
So if I'm understanding the analysis correctly, the strategy is to make themselves so technologically vital to the security apparatus of Western powers, that the U.S. and European governments are structurally, fundamentally forced to support them.
Exactly.
If you control the tech, you hold the leverage, effectively overriding any diplomatic pressure regarding human rights abuses or violations of international law.
Precisely. If you are the sole supplier and maintainer of the foundational operating system that runs the United States surveillance state and military targeting networks, the United States simply cannot afford to sanction you, no matter what you do.
You have made yourself immune to consequence.
You really have.
Once again, we have to ground this in your reality, listening to this right now. The same exact technological frameworks used to track and assassinate targets in Gaza, like the infamous AI program literally named Where's Daddy, which the reports say is designed to track suspected militants and wait until they return to their family homes before authorizing an airstrike. Those exact same foundational algorithms and data scraping tools are actively being integrated into U.S. domestic law enforcement.
They're the tools being used to deport migrants, to monitor your local protests, and analyze the data on the smartphone you are likely holding right now.
The boundary that used to exist between foreign military occupation and domestic civilian policing has essentially collapsed.
And it has been facilitated entirely by the unchecked expansion of this technology.
All of this sophisticated control, the tech, the lobbying, the media manipulation, it requires facilitators.
It requires people who operate in the shadows to connect the billionaires, the intelligence agencies, and the politicians.
This brings us to the intelligence web and the world of shadow diplomacy, because if you want to understand how this global elite truly operates, you have to look at the ultimate fixer.
And the documents bring up a name that instantly causes a stir, but they analyze him through a strictly geopolitical lens: Jeffrey Epstein.
It is vital to state that the intelligence documents provided here push back incredibly hard against the mainstream, sanitized narrative that Epstein was merely a prolific confidence man.
Or a rogue, eccentric financier who happened to run a blackmail ring.
The evidentiary trail suggests something much darker, that he was a highly protected asset deeply embedded within a complex web of U.S., Israeli, and allied intelligence services.
The investigative reports brought the receipts on this. Let's look at the timeline.
In 1999, which is years prior to his first highly publicized conviction in Florida, Epstein filed a formal, anonymous FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request, directly to the CIA.
The documents show he was legally seeking any records that might reflect an acknowledged official agency affiliation between himself and the Central Intelligence Agency.
And the records show he followed up on this exact same request again in 2011.
As the intelligence analysts and the sources point out, this is highly anomalous, almost unheard of behavior for a civilian financier.
It's just one of two things. Either he was an individual actively trying to force a reluctant intelligence agency to officially acknowledge a past working relationship.
Or, more likely, he was putting them on notice.
Right. It reads as a subtle bureaucratic threat to reveal what he knows and who he has compromised if the agency doesn't step in to offer him protection from domestic law enforcement.
And his connections extended far beyond the CIA. The source materials contain transcripts of explosive audio where Epstein is secretly recording a private meeting between himself and Ehud Barak,
The former prime minister of Israel and the former head of Israeli military intelligence.
In this recording, they aren't discussing mundane financial matters. They are discussing Peter Thiel and Palantir.
Epstein is actively, confidently advising the former prime minister of Israel on exactly which Silicon Valley venture capitalists he should partner with to build out the surveillance infrastructure we just talked about.
Furthermore, the text cites an official FBI report detailing an interview with an informant.
This informant claimed that Epstein's prominent lawyer, Alan Dershowitz, explicitly told the U.S. attorney during negotiations that Epstein belonged to intelligence.
And that if they pressed too hard, Mossad would then call Dershowitz to debrief.
The FBI informant became absolutely convinced that Epstein was, at the very least, a co-opted, highly protected Mossad agent operating on American soil.
We also see documented evidence of Epstein conducting high-level shadow diplomacy with the Russian Federation.
The reports contain emails where Epstein is communicating directly with Sergei Belikov.
Belikov is not a random banker. He is a graduate of the FSB Academy, the successor to the KGB, who became a highly placed senior Russian economic official.
In these emails, Epstein is casually asking the FSB for a favor to deal with a Russian woman who is allegedly blackmailing powerful businessmen in New York.
These interactions clearly illustrate that Epstein operated in a rarefied space where high finance, statecraft, and covert intelligence gathering all seamlessly intersected.
He wasn't simply running an illegal blackmail ring for personal gratification. He was brokering and manipulating geopolitical relationships at the highest levels of global power.
The most glaring, undeniable example of this shadow brokering outlined in the sources revolves around the Leviathan offshore gas deal.
Yes, the Leviathan field. This was a massive, unprecedented natural gas discovery off the coast of Israel.
The analysts value it as a $35 billion asset. Finding this field completely transformed the energy politics of the entire Eastern Mediterranean, turning Israel from an energy importer into a massive potential exporter.
The investigative reports show that Epstein was directly advising Ehud Barak on how to navigate the international markets to find foreign investors for this massive energy monopoly.
But the journalist uncovered a truly chilling coincidence regarding the timeline of these negotiations.
Epstein successfully secured a private, high-level meeting between current Prime Minister Netanyahu and senior J.P. Morgan executives, including Jess Staley.
That pivotal meeting took place on a very specific date, March 23, 2011.
And we have to unpack exactly why that specific date is so significant to the geopolitical narrative.
It is significant because March 23, 2011 was the exact same day that the Israeli Knesset Finance Committee was holding a massive, highly contested vote on the Shoshinsky bill.
This bill proposed a massive tax increase on natural gas exports, meaning the state would take a much larger cut of the profits.
The foreign investors and energy conglomerates were furious, actively threatening to walk away from the entire $35 billion deal if the tax increase went through.
Yet, at the 11th hour, while Epstein was brokering this meeting with J.P. Morgan and Netanyahu, the tax stability that the massive investors demanded was miraculously secured.
It is a textbook example that perfectly illustrates the central thesis of our entire deep dive today.
The real tectonic decisions shaping the region, the control of billions of dollars in vital energy resources, the flow of global capital, are not being debated in democratic parliaments.
They're being managed and decided behind closed doors by an intersection of intelligence assets, high finance executives, and heads of state.
Epstein was a crucial, heavily protected facilitator of this shadow infrastructure.
We have covered an immense amount of ground, and we are treading into dark areas that have historically spawned countless wild theories.
Which means we have to address how to categorize all of this. We need to separate baseless conspiracy from empirical geopolitics.
The documents tackle this head-on by deconstructing the narrative difference between two terms, Pax Judaica versus Pax Hebraica.
This is a critical, necessary distinction made repeatedly by the academic sources in our stack.
The term Pax Judaica is highly controversial and incredibly dangerous. The sociological analyses explicitly warn that the vast majority of its use online is directly tied to deeply ingrained anti-Semitic conspiracy theories.
It evokes the toxic, centuries-old myth of a secret global Jewish cabal controlling the world from the shadows.
Or in Islamic eschatology, it's tied to the terrifying era ruled by the Dajjal, the Antichrist figure.
Right, the idea of a shadowy, secret worldwide dictatorship pulling all the strings. The academic sources are absolutely clear and unequivocal. This is a toxic, baseless fiction.
It is conspiracy theory designed to incite hate, and it must be entirely rejected by anyone engaging in serious geopolitical analysis.
But, and this is a massive, crucial pivot made by the researchers, the sources also emphatically state that we cannot let the noise and toxicity of that anti-Semitic conspiracy theory act as a permanent smokescreen.
We cannot allow the fear of being labeled a conspiracy theorist to shield actual, observable state power from legitimate, rigorous criticism.
Exactly. The geopolitical scientists and academics in these documents completely abandon the conspiratorial, racist framework of Pax Judaica and instead pivot to analyze the actual empirical, observable reality of what they call Pax Hebraica or Pax Israelica.
So let's break that down for the listener. What is the actual, on-the-ground reality of Pax Hebraica?
The defining characteristic of Pax Hebraica is that it is not a hidden conspiracy.
It is a public, overt, highly documented grand strategy by the State of Israel to achieve absolute asymmetric regional hegemony in the Middle East.
It is a statecraft blueprint. It relies on establishing the absolute technological dominance we discussed with the Pax Silica doctrine.
It relies heavily on maintaining the unwavering protection of the U.S. military umbrella, a symbiotic defense relationship that military analysts refer to as the tandem.
And we see this hegemony being aggressively driven by overt diplomatic maneuvers like the Abraham Accords.
The strategic goal of these accords is to force economic normalization and create a unified, impenetrable security bloc with authoritarian Arab states.
The primary objective is to contain and isolate Iran, all while entirely bypassing the Palestinian issue and permanently neutralizing any historical territorial grievances without ever having to offer a political solution.
It is a factual, aggressive restructuring of the Middle Eastern order. It is enforced through overwhelming military might, economic leverage, and technological supremacy.
The sociologists point out a major problem in public discourse. By intentionally conflating this observable, documented statecraft with the anti-Semitic Pax Judaica myth, defenders of the state can unfairly dismiss legitimate critics of this geopolitical reality as bigots.
This tactic effectively stifles any vital, necessary debate on international law, human rights, and the ethics of global hegemony.
Which perfectly sets up the final and most important part of our analysis. We've spent an hour talking about the billionaires, the intelligence agencies, the religious leaders, and the tech CEOs.
But what about everyone else? What is the actual human cost of this massive, interlocking power structure?
The overarching tragedy revealed by synthesizing all these diverse sources is how uniformly and systematically exploitative this entire system is. It spares almost no one.
Every day, Christians and Jews are being fundamentally manipulated. Their deeply held, sacred faiths are being cynically weaponized, turned into theological pawns to justify geopolitical land grabs and the brutal machinations of disaster capitalism.
At the same time, Muslims and Arabs are being aggressively, constantly dehumanized in the media and by politicians to manufacture public consent for kinetic wars and mass civilian casualties.
Meanwhile, everyday Americans are being quietly drained of their taxpayer wealth. Billions are siphoned away from domestic needs to fund this endless defense tech supercycle.
And simultaneously, those same citizens are being stripped of their constitutional civil liberties as the invasive surveillance tech forged in the fires of these overseas conflicts is brought home to police their own neighborhoods.
But ultimately, when you cut through all the theology, the money, and the algorithms, it is the people on the ground in the Middle East, the Iranians, the Palestinians, the Lebanese, and everyday Israeli citizens who are paying the ultimate terrifying physical price.
They are the ones trapped under the bombs. They are the ones facing the stark reality of war, death, displacement, and the brutal restructuring of their lives by disaster capitalism.
When you look at the totality of the evidence, it is a violent, large-scale reorganization of global capital, energy corridors, and physical land. And it is being executed under the perfect, blinding camouflage of a divine imperative and national security.
To recap, we have traveled through a staggering, labyrinthine web of information today.
We started by stripping away the public relations narrative to expose the material drivers, the desperate fight to maintain the petrodollar, the control over global energy corridors like the Strait of Hormuz, and the incredibly lucrative defense tech supercycle that actively profits from the prospect of war with Iran.
We unpacked how 19th century Christian Zionism and modern Israeli messianic extremism provide the necessary theological engine, creating a literal death cult ideology that bypasses democratic logic to manufacture consent for a regional Armageddon.
We then pulled back the curtain on the shadowy infrastructure of influence. We examined how massive mega donors and lobbying groups like CUFI and AIPAC utilize legalized bribery to completely capture the political process.
While media conglomerates and tech billionaires manipulate the linguistic narrative and deploy psychological operations to violently silence grassroots dissent.
We looked at the terrifying automated digital dragnet of Pax Silica, where AI tools like Palantir and Celebrate are used to predict pre-crime and track citizens globally.
And we expose the covert intelligence web brokering these massive geopolitical deals, featuring highly protected figures like Jeffrey Epstein acting as shadow diplomats for $35 billion natural gas monopolies.
Finally, we separated the toxic anti-Semitic myths from the stark, observable geopolitical reality of Israel's strategy for asymmetric regional hegemony.
It is an overwhelming amount of information to process.
But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final, highly provocative thought that emerges only when we look at where all these different vectors, the theology, the tech, the warfare, are heading in the near future.
Okay, lay it on us.
We have seen how deeply apocalyptic theology is driving military policy, and we have seen the rapid, unchecked rise of autonomous AI-driven surveillance and weapon systems.
You're talking about the predictive algorithms and the where's daddy targeting systems that automate life and death?
Yes. I want you to consider the ultimate, terrifying endgame of merging this radical religious fervor with artificial intelligence.
Oh, wow.
What happens when individuals who genuinely believe that global conflict, environmental destruction, and mass death are literal divine mandates are given the keys to autonomous AI systems?
If an algorithm is designed to predict threats, track entire populations in real time, and designate kill targets across vast data webs with absolutely zero human empathy or oversight, does human morality or the Geneva Conventions or international law even matter anymore?
That is a genuinely terrifying prospect, giving a machine the power to enact a holy war.
We have to ask ourselves, are we entering a new era where the end times isn't brought about by some divine cosmic intervention from above, but by a self-fulfilling prophecy?
A cataclysm coded directly into the very operating systems of our military and law enforcement agencies by the very people who desire the apocalypse.
We will leave you with that chilling thought to mull over. The systems governing our world are vastly more complex and often much darker than they appear on the surface. Keep asking questions, keep looking beyond the official narratives provided by the state and the media, and never stop critically examining the power structures that dictate our reality. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.